Republican Party, and the Democratic Party were fairly equal in every election. But one of the things that hampered the Republicans is they were divided between factions. The mugwumps, the half-breeds, and the stalwarts. And we had just been talking about that just recently. And we said, the mugwumps were the real distinctive faction of the Republican Party. They were the legitimate reformers. The half-breeds and the stalwarts just followed sort of different leadership, but weren't very different. The stalwarts followed Roscoe Conklin, the half-breeds followed James Blaine of Maine, and we talked a little bit about that. We also talked about the issues during the time, and what we said was this, that for the most part, in most campaigns, the politicians avoided taking positions on issues. But there were really some issues that were there. It's just that they didn't take positions. And one of the issues that divided people politically was currency. Another issue was patronage. And another issue was tariffs. So the currency issue was an issue. The issue of patronage was an issue. And the issue of tariffs were an issue. Now, it is true that politicians, because of how close the elections were, tried to skirt these issues. But they were issues. In terms of currency, the issue was hard money versus soft money. Soft money people wanted currency expansion. If I was for soft money, I would want more greenbacks and the free and unlimited coinage of silver at 16-1. If I was for hard money, I would want the gold standard, right? That issue emerges in the Hayes administration because of the Panic of 73, or 73, sorry. The issue of patronage emerges in the Garfield administration. Why? Why does the issue of patronage, this is a very overt reason, why does the issue of patronage emerge? Go ahead, dear Nicole.
He was murdered by a person.
Yeah, he was murdered by a deranged office seeker and who wanted a job, which was patronage. And so it is in the Garfield/Arthur administration that the first meaningful piece of civil service reform is passed. And does anybody besides the instructor remember what the name of that legislation was? Yes, go ahead. The Pendleton or the Civil Service Act that was passed in 1883. Now, in the Cleveland administration, right, which is going to follow Arthur, because remember, Cleveland is going to be the first Democratic president to be elected since Buchanan, the issue became the tariff. So, you have three issues. You have, currency, and that's kind of an issue in the Hayes administration. You have patronage, and that's an issue in the Garfield-Arthur administration. And now in the Cleveland administration, you have the tariff, and that's an issue in his administration. Republicans tended to support higher tariffs to protect industry and wages. Democrats tended to support lower tariffs, to lower prices, and to assure more exports. Remember, we said that when Cleveland was elected to the presidency, he didn't like tariffs because it resulted, in his mind, in greater surpluses in the national government. And those surpluses were disturbing to him because he thought that the Republicans doled those out to Civil War veterans fraudulently, and this created power for the Republican Party, which he wanted to break. The tariff issue doesn't work out very well for Cleveland. Remember, the Republicans used that against him in the election of '88, and as a result of that, maybe he is defeated by Harrison in '88. And Harrison's election in '88 represents the Republicans taking the House, the Republicans taking the Senate, and the presidency. Now, you should probably be familiar with the presidents. You got Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur. You've got Cleveland, Harrison is the Gilded Age presidents. The issues, the political situation you find in chapter 24 in your text. Now, in chapter 27, there is a lot of discussion about expansion into the West. And the first part of those pages that I asked you to look at involved the relations between the settlers that came from the East, the Europeans, and the original residents of the West, the Native Americans. And so there are lots of questions about the conflicts between these groups. I think your textbook says there was like 100 or 200 pitched battles between Native Americans and troops and U.S. federal troops. And so, you have what sometimes they call the Indian Wars, right? The Indian Wars in the West. And, there are going to be questions on the test about that, and you probably did research into that for some of your papers. So you can expect questions about, sort of the Plains Indian, the significance of the buffalo to the Native Americans from the Plains is something else that you might want to look at. Eventually, however, the 4 things that I want you to make sure that you are familiar with out of those pages is this. One is a book that was published entitled A Century of Dishonor. Does anybody besides myself know who wrote that book? A Century of Dishonor, 1881. Anybody besides myself? Sarah, do not call me Natalie. Do you have any idea? Would it be Helen Hunt Jackson? A Century of Dishonor was written by Helen Hunt Jackson in 1881 that talks about how badly Europeans, whites, had treated Native Americans. Sometimes, I don't know, maybe I didn't put it on the website, but sometimes a lot of people will use excerpts from her book on the project that we do, Helen Hunt Jackson. That's like a big deal. For one reason or another, it always ends up on the AP test. Helen Hunt Jackson, A Century of Dishonor, 1881. Something else that always ends up on the AP test was in 1887, Congress passed something called the Dawes Act. D-A-W-E-S. The Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act really established a kind of a permanent relationship between the national government and the Native American tribes of the West. One of the things that the Dawes Act did was offer to Native American heads of households 160 acres of land in Indian reservations. One of the criticisms of the Dawes Act was okay, it seems like this is an enlightened piece of legislation that's going to offer Native Americans the opportunity to acquire property, that they can farm, but it sort of doesn't acknowledge their kind of tribal culture. That these people didn't understand the notion of private ownership of property. They kind of roamed, And so the Dawes Act was good intentioned, but maybe didn't work out as well as it was expected to. And so you should read about that. I mean, there's questions on the test. And the Dawes Act is actually based on something called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act you should definitely know. The Homestead Act was passed in the Lincoln administration. And what it did was, in the West, eliminate any payment for federal land. Up until the Homestead Act, the national government raised revenue by selling land in the West. Here you go. You want to go to the West, it's going to cost you X amount an acre. This is how they generated revenue, that and tariffs. With the Homestead Act and 1863, they just gave it away. You willing to go out there? We'll give you, all you got to do is claim it. 160 acres, male heads of households for nothing. All you got